let me take this opportunity to explain. If you see me lean forward to my screen with my nose on the screen, that is because I have an eyesight problem that sometimes forces me to go so close to the screen. If it gets really bad, then I'll turn off my camera because I don't want you to see my nose so close up. But I think we have it. Yeah. So to continue where I was before, the VUB multidisciplinary program. So it is there to support the development and the execution of projects on sustainable food and biomass systems. These projects can be both education and research projects. And as I said, one of the key aspects is for various reasons that we try to apply the concept of open science to the extent possible. To give you first a little bit further of the background of this program, so we were tasked in 2020 to do the following: bring together a consortium of interested groups from research and university to arrange exchanges with relevant organizations and relevant to the topic of sustainable food and biomass production, so such as the UN organizations, EU organizations, national organizations, you name it. We also had set out to identify topics for projects, both from the consortium members and these relevant organizations. Essential to all of this is that we had to arrange good collaboration with our funding departments, because it all comes and goes with funding, and you need good collaboration with the departments that are professionals in this. And it's interesting to see how many people are available to help. Also, since outreach is very important, we have set out to identify topics for outreach. And we also agreed that we would identify and formulate at least 2 pilot projects to see whether the modus operandi that we had in front of us would actually work. And the way we have tested this is, and I'll come back to it with the next slide, first to give you a flavor of where we were now, early January. We have a consortium of about 90 groups in over 45 university institutes in Europe and beyond. And this group is still growing. We have set up very good exchanges with national organizations, EU, international organizations such as the FAO, EU organizations, European Food Forum, which is a group of members of the European Parliament, DG Research, DG Agri, you name it, and we have good collaborations with them, and also increasingly with national organizations. And all of that is to get input from them, feedback from them on the overall program and on individual projects. In all our discussions, we collected over about 100 topics to be addressed in these projects, and not each of these has to become a separate project, but these were all mentioned as important elements to be included. This can be very specific topics to very broad concepts, such as open science. We made very good working arrangements with the funding departments, and that includes the funding departments from the VUB and the UOB, where Françoise comes from. And we identified a dozen of topics for outreach events. We have also established a number of pilot projects, or started working with them. And the way we do this is as follows. If we get feedback from our consortium members and these international organizations as a certain topic that would really be worthwhile to address in a research or an education project, we write a 1-page summary, an outline of that project. We send that outline to our funding departments and ask them whether this particular idea could find a reasonable way to apply for funding. And if the feedback is yes, there is a realistic way for funding, then we just elaborate the outline of 1 page into 2 or 3 pages, and we send it to all the 90 groups. And we ask them 2 things. Are you interested? And do you have the right expertise to participate? And once we get the feedback that people are interested and have the right expertise, then we develop the proposal. And we will work together with the funding departments to submit it. So in this process, we have now 4 pilot projects ahead of us, and let me just take you quickly through them. The first one is what we call a crop improvement compass, and I will continue that in the next slide. But just to give you the rest of the list, we have in preparation a project called PhD Plus, and there's a training program to support aspirational PhD students by broadening their research, by including multidisciplinary systems thinking, foresight planning, open science, impact assessment, and so forth. Because very often we see PhD students doing fantastic work on a specific topic, but let's say they work in something in life sciences or in plant breeding, then the next question comes is that if they are successful with their research, how will they make sure that these products find a home with, for example, farmers? And all of that requires a broader way of thinking, and we call that PhD+. This is in preparation. We're also thinking about a project called Sustainability Governance, and that links directly back to the Green Deal and to the Farm to Fork strategy, is that if we need to change massively our food production, our biomass production, it requires that the actual actors on the floor change and make adjustments, such as farmers, but also needs that governance is changed, that the governance is focused on sustainability. So what we aim to do here is to prepare a multidisciplinary curriculum that addresses aspects that are relevant for sustainability. And first of all is to understand the underlying science, of climate change, of biodiversity loss, etc. Then to provide training in how do you develop policies that are what we call data-driven. And then how do you implement those policies in a way that is evidence-based, and data-driven and evidence-based are very important concepts, as well as that are consistent with international obligations. The task of governance, and I'm a former government official myself, it gets more complicated with the day, because every time you open your eyes, there is a new international obligation that you have to comply with. So that will be a project on sustainability governance. We're in the early stages of discussing this. To give you an idea, the Crop Improvement Compass is in its final stages of formulation and will be submitted next week. The PhD Plus project is being formulated as we speak, and we are in the early stages of the Sustainability Governance project. Another suggestion project is assessment of the Farm to Fork goals. And that will be a multidisciplinary assessment of the feasibility of the Farm to Fork goals, as well as the environmental, economic, and social impacts of the implementation of those goals. So these are a number of projects we have now started thinking about and actually working on under the VUB program. Let me focus briefly on this first one, the Crop Improvement Compass. But before doing so, just last December, we evaluated how did this all work. Well, getting 90 consortium partners, getting all the other parts in place. We could only conclude that there is great interest in participating in this. And the way we have set this up, in a very simple way of first communicating with our funding departments, whether there's an avenue for funding, and then continuing from there, is clearly very effective, efficient, and flexible, because nothing is done in structures. It is a program that you can adjust quite quickly. So as a result, and on the basis of this, the VUB Research Council that had decided in 2019 that we should have such a program, decided in December 2020 to expand the support of the program, so we will continue and expand. If you want updates, and let me say here, you will get copies of the PowerPoints after this webinar. If you want any further updates on the overall program, this is the link, and if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. And let me now turn to this first project that we are developing, the Crop Improvement Compass. The background of this project is that reducing the environmental and climate impacts of agriculture requires multiple strategies for different aspects of farming. And this ranges for the way you farm, what you plant for varieties and so forth. So there are many different aspects of farming that require improvement. And one of those strategies is to give farmers access to improved crops. And this would mean improved crops in the sense of sustainability, so that produce more per hectare of land, more per liter of water, and more per unit of fertilizer, so that we need less land, less water, and less fertilizer. Crops that are resistant to pests and diseases, i.e. that we need less pesticides. Crops that are tolerant to drought and flooding, so we need to irrigate less, and also that we have crops that are ready for the impacts of climate change. Crops that can be grown on marginal soils, such as saline soils that we see increasingly coming up at coastal areas. And of course, crops that have all kinds of important qualities, such as nutritional qualities. One of the reasons that we have a focus on improved crops, improved seeds, is along the lines of what the FAO has been saying for many years, is crops are to a large extent scale independent. This means that improved crops are useful for both very small farmers or farming systems, as well as to large farming systems. So the aim of this project focuses on this particular aspect. There is one caveat here, is that over the years, over the decades, we have seen a decrease in public investment in plant breeding. And as a result, you see that the plant breeding is largely addressed by the private sector. And there's a concern that this will result in a small number of major food crops. At the moment, it is about 70 to 80% of our caloric intake comes from 4 to 5 crops. And this creates a vulnerability in our food systems. And the underlying problem here also by the decrease of public investment is that there is a lack of information. And that lack of information and the lack of exchange of information hampers publicly funded research to make good strategic international planning to produce plants, improve crops and plants for sustainable farming. And this is exactly what the Crop Improvement Project aims at. What it aims to do is to establish a platform where you can store, curate and share information on what we call needs for crop improvement and solutions, and not only current needs, but also anticipated needs, let's say in terms of climate change, and solutions for crop improvement that we need now and we need later. At the second phase, this is a database, and I'll come back to that. And the second part will be to produce guidance for long-term strategic planning. Where do we need to go if we want to reduce the impact on the environment and to adjust to the changes of the environment, such as climate change? And for this project aims to produce a guidance document. So the methodology, the heart of this project, we call it the Crop Improvement Compass. And we use the term compass because a compass doesn't tell you where to go, but it gives you informed, or makes it possible for you to make informed decisions where you can go. Yeah, so we call this the Crop Improved Compass. It's a database, and in the database we will put the following information. First of all, and this is per country, what are the most important key crops at the moment in that country? What are the anticipated key crops? And again, this may be because of climate change, maybe because of changing in consumer preference, but you make an analysis of what are the key crops in a country. Then you ask yourself and put in this database, what are the challenges in growing those crops or in handling those crops? And this may be, the challenges may be drought or flooding or diseases or pests or a variety of things. And then we ask ourselves, what are these practices to address, the current practices to address those challenges? So what are the practices to address drought or diseases or pests? And then comes the important question, what are the environmental, economic and social impacts of those practices that are used to address these challenges in agriculture? What are the environmental, economic and social impacts of the use of pesticides, of the use of fertilizers, of the use of, and you can mention the whole range. And then, of course, most importantly, if we talk about crop improvement, what are the existing and plans for crop improvement to address those impacts? Impacts whereby if the goal is, as the Farm to Fork says, to reduce the use of damaging pesticides, is how can you do that? Well, one of the ways to do this is to make plants resistant against disease, resistant against pests and so forth. So the methodology is one, first of all, it's a database where we collectively enter this information. We collect it and we bring it in. And then we make it public so that it can be consulted by stakeholders such as other researchers, farmers, industry, consumers, and so forth and so forth. So this is the whole idea. The status of this project is that actually this week we are finalizing it. That will be submitted by the end of the week or early next week, which is why we're very happy to have this discussion about the concept of open science so that we can check whether everything we have in there is indeed in line with that idea. The proposal will be submitted under the Horizon 2020 Green Deal call, the Farm to Fork call. It will be a large-sized project, so a multi-million-dollar project proposal. At the moment, we have a multidisciplinary, and I really mean multidisciplinary, ranging from molecular biology to ecology to history to climate change and so forth, of 27 project partners, and really with a broad range of experience. We will collect data in about 15 EU EEA countries and about another 5 non-EU EEA countries. And the submission deadline is the 26th of January, i.e. somewhere next week. Now, in this whole process of preparing this proposal, we came up with a number of questions, or a number of questions just came up when we made again clear that this project proposal should reflect how it complies with open science. And there were a number of very general questions. Because we as scientists, we are trained that you only publish something if you're certain, and the whole peer review mechanism is part of that. And how does that relate to open science? The other question that came up, when is something data in the sense of open science? Is that the very first raw data? Is that the processed data, etc.? I just saw one chat coming in, someone asking whether conspiracy theories are data in the sense of open science. And I had to chuckle about that. But there is something in there is that if we talk about data in the sense of open science, then we need to know what this is. And there's also reference to who are the knowledge actors? Are that other scientists? Is that the whole world? So these are a number of very general questions that came up. Then we had a few specific questions, specific for this project. One is that if you want to get a good idea of what crop improvement is in the pipeline, then it will be important to also include the developments in the commercial breeding sector. However, commercial breeders may not be keen to share these data if they know that it will be open from the beginning. So the question that came up is how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that on the one hand, you would like to get data from important actors, and on the other hand, if you apply the open science concept, this may just make them very hesitant to share any of those data, or at least the level of detail that you would like. And then the last practical question, I don't know whether you can see this, is that it is good practice for any project that if you develop a database that you have what we call a continuation or an exploitation strategy. And that means how can you make sure that the database will be used and updated after the project is over. And very often in these projects, there are mechanisms to do so. For example, you charge a fee for whoever wants to use the database. But of course, if the data is already open in the concept of open science, how can you then charge people fees for data that is already open? So these were the kinds of questions that came up in our discussions. I've shared them with René earlier on. So I look forward to his responses to these questions. I will look very much forward to Françoise's observations in this field. And from then on, we look forward to your input. I understand there have been some chats. Every now and then you'll see me turn off my camera because then I have to put my nose on my screen to collect all the chats. And with this, I'm going to invite, I would say first, René, if you could address the first few questions that I had on my last slide, and if you want, I can put them back on again. René, the floor is yours.
Yes, please put them back again, Piet. I have an aging brain, so I don't remember them now by heart. I can't hear you anymore, Piet. I don't know if you are muted, I think.
Sorry, I wasn't. Thank you for reminding me. And if you can take these first, the general questions, the fact that as a scientist, you're trained to not just throw out everything that you have found, but that you think about it carefully, that you push and pull it through peer review, etc. How does that relate? Because you would want to avoid that your early results are not mature enough and create confusion and perhaps even concern that is not necessary.
Yes, I understand that. It's of course, if you practice open science in a certain way, it's a shift of attitude towards what stage you actually share your information with colleagues. It's not, maybe also in the light of COVID, we had this before, where in COVID actually researchers did publish much earlier than otherwise, and this then raised in a societal context some confusion. As you may know, maybe you refer to that. But the instance here, the criterion on publishing and as a final output is something else than publishing with a view on getting feedback from your colleagues. So if you share information in an open science for Facebook context, is different than publishing, of course, in a journal. I mean, in a journal, most likely you want to publish something from which you are convinced this is the case, that it's a final output. So open science is, of course, you communicate, and publishing between brackets is then happening along the way all the time. So it's not about that you have to be 100% certain about your facts. This is not why you do it. I mean, it's also better for your research process actually to get earlier feedback, which actually avoids you to produce a lot of time. You know, otherwise you would spend a lot of time more and to find out later that your data are not correct or wrong. So you will of course proceed with discussing things much more earlier in the process. So the criterion whether you are certain or not, that's not a criterion for sharing. You share when you think these are relevant. This can also be raw data, whether they are relevant, and you need to be sure. And the sharing can, of course, relate to different contexts. I mean, in the science, you know, if you remember my diagram of the research cycle, if you are in the scientific discovery phase, then of course the sharing is more with your immediate colleagues or people from other labs or whatever. It's not. So the sharing relates then also to another audience. So I mean, this actually then also who are the knowledge actors? In fact, I mean, you cannot give a general answer to that. It's for every discipline. And this is of course different. I mean, for food scientists in the beginning, this can also be a narrow range of researchers, but in a later phase, it can even include farmers or other actors who are relevant when it comes to putting up the research agenda. I mean, you interesting enough already referred to that because of a lack of public investment, you see a narrowing of the private sector in particular commodities. So these type of things is actually also a consequence of having a very competitive and closed system, innovation system, because you know, the industries, of course, work on what they can make money with, and these are the commodities. And so this can lead to a much more poorer agriculture. So it is important there to open this system up. And the same is, you know, the relevance to COVID is the same. And like the major diseases on Earth are not investigated substantially. Malaria is the disease most affected. You know, most people on Earth are affected by it. It's under research. We are dependent on philanthropists to do it. And with COVID, it would have been the same, you know, if we would not have done public investment. So again, this opening up to research sector, and this means also public authorities in some cases, can redirect to research as well. So this when you share and with whom you share really depends on the phase, of course, where you are in. There are no general rules, of course. It's for a physicist, it's different than for a food scientist. So these were, I mean, the screen is gone again. You had more questions, I think?
I had a few more questions, but these are the general ones I'd like to discuss first. So let me invite Françoise to share her views on these general questions and others to comment, and then we can come to the more specific questions. And then I invite others who are working on projects, whether they have any specific questions they would like to see addressed. Françoise.
Yes, regarding sharing your research results as soon as possible, this is current practice in some disciplines, and it even becomes more generalized with the preprint servers. You know, Archive, and now there are many other servers in other disciplines. So this is not something new, but it becomes more generalized, and that's good. And so there also you can share your very early results, and you can have feedback on these results in a more informal way than submitting a publication to a journal. Now, regarding what is data, I think also anything that can be useful to the other researchers, or maybe even to society. We can also think about other actors or other interested people, interested parties in the society. And also open science is also supporting citizen science, so involving citizens in some part of the research process, whether it's just gathering information or even more than that, and being really involved in the research. And they're also sharing data with with citizens is also important to inform them, and then to have their feedback and to involve them afterwards. It's important to, and any data, I think, that can be of interest to some of these external parties, even outside the research community, may be shared. Were there other questions?
There are a few more specific ones, but I'd like to address these general ones, because I know this comes up in all these discussions. And I think one important comment that René made is that sharing is not cookie cutter, is that it may mean sharing among your fellow scientists, or you may have broader groups, and it is very much case specific. So I think that is a good comment to make. Let me check, and I can't quite see it, so I'll ask Laura or Vicky. Are there any further chats on?
There are no questions at the moment in the chat, so you can continue your discussion, and when one will come, I will let you know. So.
Perfect. So those are a few of the general questions that have come up in our discussion. Let me just share then the more specific one, or actually I can repeat the specific one. And this will be first to René, is that in the project we're preparing, this is a database on crop improvement. We would of course like to include crop improvement in the public sector and in the private sector. Crop improvement activities in the larger companies as well as in SMEs. But from initial discussions, of course, we have had with the private sector on this, is that their first reaction was that we're not keen to share information if we know that this will be from early on made public, especially if it is our initial research, where we still are trying things out. How do people in general deal with this? Is that you on the one hand you want to rely on information from certain sectors, and those same sectors are hesitant to share with you because they know it will be open. René?
Yes, yeah, this is an important and also indeed a difficult issue which you have to resolve in the context of your project. I mean, I'm not sure if you now ask me the question, what happens if this group submits a proposal for research funding and easy research in this context, or in general that it's a tricky issue. But I mean, so maybe you clarify this, because this is maybe that the answer is actually can be different, of course.
Yeah, so the question that came up for us was either we submit the proposal and say we leave out asking the private sector, which would mean leaving out a very important part of crop improvement. Mm-hmm. Or you include and say, well, we will try to ask the private sector, but be aware that they may not provide the information because of the concept of open science. Or can we approach this as saying we can partially apply open science for those who provide from the public sector data, but we will have to keep closed information from the private sector. So there are all kinds of avenues.
All right, and so you actually asked the question in relation to a concrete proposal under the rationale of these research. So then, yeah, then I mean, first of all, of course, I mean, when it comes to public funding, and if the private sector wants to get public funding as well, then they have to play according to the rules of public funding. It's very simple. You know, they can, you know, when it comes, for example, you know, some information which is related to, which are proprietary, you know, which are protected by IPR, and or where maybe even in publications where they want to keep this information private, then you can argue for an exception. So under these, you know, as I said before, the default option, the general option is, of course, and all these things, open access, open data, are mandatory, but there are cases where you can make these exceptions. Now, I think the way you put it, actually, it was, I think, not a very convincing case to make an exception, because if I would say, well, you know, if they want to join, I mean, they also benefit from the public funding in this case, and vice versa, there is something expected from them to deliver. And I think in the context of your proposal, it's indeed a benefit for the proposal, and it makes sense for a proposal also to include the private sector to make this step forward. I understand there is always in the private sector a general hesitation, but one has to acknowledge that if you want to make transformative steps, so, you know, you especially also in agricultural research, if you want to go beyond, if you want to break through, you know, the thing what you know just highlighted, the risk of that we get ever a smaller, poorer range of crops in the future, commodity-based and shipped worldwide everywhere. Big agriculture things. If you want to break through this, that requires public investment. This is among others the Commission. And in that case, we have to, of course, understand that the rationale of sharing this information is essential. So this can be done in consortium agreements. I mean, I mean, there is no, also not a general rule, but I can imagine that for a consortium, you make an agreement with each other on how to deal with it, because I can also understand that in some projects, for example, the research partners would also have access to pre-existing data at private companies. Now, then the companies can say, we do that or we don't do that. So if they don't do that, I can understand that there's a reasonability behind it not to do that. So this type of thing you can, of course, detail further in your consortium agreement. But so, yeah, again, so this is a case-for-case approach. Again, there is no hard line where these things, but in any way, in getting research funds, it will be evaluated whether it's reasonable to do that, yes or no.
Right. Let me just clarify one thing, because I fully agree with you that if private sector companies want to join as project partners, they want to get money, they have to play by the rules. These are not private sector breeders that want to be part of the program or the project. These are, because the project almost exclusively consists of public university and public research institutions. But we would like to knock on the door of private sector breeders to get their information. Yeah. So they don't, the private sector breeders get no money out of this. They're being just asked for a favor to share what are their investments, where are they going, what are they thinking about breeding, which direction, etc. So it's not a matter of in the consortium agreement. This is just us knocking on the door of others.
Okay. Yeah, but then it becomes different, and then I mean, then it's obvious that you would among yourself apply your open science practices rules, and you, in part of your proposal, you have a sort of reach out to the private sector who are not research partners as such, or are not actors as such, and who also don't receive funding. If they don't receive funding, then there is also no argument to bind them to any rules of DG research, of course.
And this would also mean that we as a project group, we can keep that section of the data that we have received voluntarily from others. We can keep that then out of, if they request so, out of the open science part.
Yeah, that sounds to me completely reasonable in that case, of course, because it's part, okay, the data generation and your research, your data management plan refers notably to what type of data you are going to produce during the course of your project. And this relates to your research partners and not to the private sector. The private sector in your proposal is just indeed what you say, an outreach partner, so to speak, which actually also spices up your proposal, because you show that you want to be inclusive, but this has a certain limit in terms of doing your research project. This sounds to me completely normal.
That sounds very reassuring, and I know there are a number of project partners on this call who will be reassured by this notion. Françoise, did you have any additional points you'd like to make on this?
Just thinking about it, but one way of avoiding this reluctance to face this reluctance of private companies to share their data might be to anonymize their data before sharing them. It just,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's something that you used to do or not. I have no experience in project management working in a library, but I was just thinking that it could be a possibility to anonymize the data.
That's indeed a good suggestion. We have been thinking about it a little bit. There are limits to what you can anonymize, because in the breeding world, trust me, people know who is working on which crops and so forth. Let me go to the second question then. We check again. Are there any chats? I don't think so. Vicky, correct me if I'm wrong.
Not at the moment, so you can
Good.
continue.
Yeah, well, I can imagine, because René's answer was straightforward and clear. I have the next question, René, or to one of your colleagues, because I understand that a few of the DG Research colleagues are also on this call, so please join in if you can help. The other thing we're struggling with in this and also other proposals, that if you develop a database, it is good practice to show in the project proposal, and it just makes good sense in general, how will you continue this database after the project is over? How will you continue including data, and how will you continue maintaining the database, security, and so forth and so forth? And one of the standard mechanisms that have always been applied in databases is, in continuing them, is that if after the project is over, you could charge a small fee for people who want to use those data, because those are relevant data. But this becomes difficult, because why would people pay a fee for data if they're open science anyway? So they have access to them, because this drastically reduces the possibility of what we call a continuation plan. What are you doing with the database after the project is over? René, or any of your colleagues?
Well, I mean, this, the question you now actually raised was an issue for research infrastructures in general, with there is a history of funding research infrastructures by the Commission. And as you all know, research projects are always limited in time. And then you have indeed a risk that, at the end of the project, your data would not be created anymore because nobody works on it, and it's a loss of investment. And this is actually what happens. Apparently, I think on a global scale, I think we lose 80% of our research data continuously. So there's a lot to gain. So that's also against this background. This was also actually one of the, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons was actually to set up an European Open Science Cloud, which is permanent, which would not suffer from this financing issue, and where you have an ongoing curation of your data, making them fair and so on. It requires already to put them in a format which will be reusable for time and so on. So the future answer is really the European Open Science Cloud, which I think my colleagues have now been working on, also to include a sort of data cloud for the biosciences. I think I put you in contact with a colleague of mine. I have not much understanding of the details of that myself. I'm not so much a data person, but this is happening, and so this generally is indeed an issue. But your other question is, with the new framework program, one should not forget that if you publish or you have your data, all your outputs are owned by the beneficiary, so you remain your owner. But of course, the requirement is indeed your data have to be in an open access depository. So this applies for your data as well as for your publications. So, but the EOS would be the future answer for this, for a more permanent solution. And for minor projects which cannot make use of particular research infrastructures, then this deficit of losing your data on the long term will remain, unfortunately. we have to move to indeed a more permanent solution there.
Let me follow up on this, and I see there are chats coming in too. The question of continuation of the database has two aspects. One is just the infrastructure, and fortunately, the VUB is in the position of offering for many years to come that the database will be hosted on their server. That's one thing. But the other part of it is, in order for a database to be useful, the content needs to be updated. And therefore, you need resources. And normally, if a database is useful, in the same way as people use, Facebook or Dropbox or anything, if you see that something is useful, then you're willing to pay a fee to get the extra and the new stuff. And the question we are faced with is that, why would people pay for getting that new data if that new data has to be open anyway? Yeah, and I see your point, and this is
but open and paying for something is not necessarily the same, I think, because that's the same with publications. I mean, a lot of publications are open access, but they are not free. So this is I mean, open means you are accessible to it. Of course, a fee should then be reasonable. I think I cannot give, to be honest, I cannot give you a definitive answer on this, but it seems to me that, my gut feeling would say in this case that once a project is closed and you have fulfilled your requirement to put your data in an open repository, it's open, it's in that sense, then any further work on your data which requires a certain cost, then I can imagine that you can ask a fee for that post-project, but I mean, certainly not during the project, but post-project it might be possible. But so free and open is not the same, huh? I mean,
I'm very glad that I'm glad that you confirm that open doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be for free.
Because also the European Open Science Cloud that can, I mean, this will be a very costly thing. I mean, member states have to put a lot of money together. If you would all science have to be in Open Science Cloud. So of course this will cost money, and institutions will need to pay. And so having access to it can mean that those who put data in it can also get data from it, but it remains still open the question that, let's say, if there are actors who only want to get out data of it, but will never put data in it, what do you do with those guys? So there are still issues to be resolved there.
Okay.
I cannot give a definitive answer on these things. I don't know.
No, we're already quite happy with the clarity you've provided about the earlier points. I see some chats coming in, but I cannot read it. Can you read it yourself, René? I assume they may be.
Let me see when I have to go to the chat room, I think.
I think there is a button that says chat, and then I see a red bull coming up, but I cannot read it.
Pete,
yeah.
May I comment on the previous discussion about these kind of business models for the database after the completion of the project? I don't know about exploiting a database of research results, but it makes me think of a business model that is used for publications, which is the freemium model. And in this model, everybody has access to the publications in PDF format for free. That's really open access. And it's the business model used by openedition.org. And for those who want additional added value services, have access to the publications in other formats like EPUB, or so yeah, you can read them on different devices. And also if you want to have statistics, usage statistics, then it's a paid for service. So and these are the libraries are paying for having these additional services. So that's kind of business models that maybe could be transposed to exploiting the databases. Just a suggestion or
Perfect.
an idea.
I'm frantically writing down all these ideas, and I know that some of my colleagues are. And I'm glad that you also came at this point, because it gave Renee a bit of time to look at the chats, at the questions that were raised. And Renee, can you read them out for everybody to hear, that we know which one you're answering? And the same, Francoise, if you see any chats you can directly answer to, please follow after Renee has been there. We have still another 15 minutes left, so we can do this. Renee, the floor is yours. Renee, the floor and the microphone are yours.
Yeah, well, I see just one question, which actually is a repetition of what we just discussing. So what to do after funding, after the completion of the project. Maybe the only additional idea I still have there is, you know, you have to ask for funding again. Huh? I mean, this is very often what happened also in the past. You work on a project, it ends, and in the new project you take up previous work, and then you include in your project with reference to the fact that you already have a database and you want to work on that, and then it becomes eligible again. But of course it requires you know, every few years a new application for funds. So maybe in the future then the European Open Science Cloud will be the definitive answer. What should be the strategy to update the database? Yeah, that we already have. So let me see if there's another question. The question on usefulness of private sector breeding data kept not in open file. I don't know what this means, this question.
Can I ask whoever raised the question to type a bit more detail in the chats and let Renee look for the other questions?
Mark Jensen, I think it was.
Go ahead. And Renee, just one point, because you said something that we have been discussing too, is that of course you can just ask for funding again after a couple of years. In this case, because I believe this project, if this goes ahead, will have an incredible multiplication factor, because seeds are not something you do for once, not one laptop you buy, but that will be available for many years to come. But the environment is changing, consumer demands are changing and so forth. So this is an exercise you would have to do regularly. And they do this actually in the United States. So the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, issues every 3 or 5 years or so what they call a breeding roadmap. And they do the exercise that we're doing, but in a far more limited form. Ours is much broader. They do this every couple of years, let's say every 5 years, and then they readjust. It's very interesting to see how these breeding roadmaps from the USDA have changed over time, simply because it is recognition that the diseases are moving, pests are moving, climate is changing, consumer preference, the whole debate about fat and cholesterol and so forth. So there are lots of things that can be done. And in addition to the suggestions from Francoise about certain fees, it could indeed be the easier solution to refresh this database with new funding, let's say after 5 years, and until that new refreshment, let the database be open and free for everybody to use. Are there further, let me just check with Vicky and Laura, are there any further chats that have not yet been answered?
Actually, yes, but it's the same question. So Sudan originally asked, like a few minutes ago, how useful would data from private sector crop breeders be if kept in a certain, not open file? So this was the original question and comment. So who could benefit from such data? This is the question.
Actually, Renee, that's a question I should address. It is true, those data would not be accessible, but they would give us as the research group insights and as to where the breeding is going or should be going. So this will be the solution from Francoise. We use in our final guidance the anonymized data to give more general anonymized information. So it would be useful for us, since we know the data is there, that we how we design the guidance document, but it would not be available to others. If this would be a section of the results that would be publicly available, and one part that would not be publicly available. Okay, are there any further questions? Vicky, have you seen any further comments that came up?
No, there are no.
Okay, then I invite whoever is on the call, and I cannot see the number, but I see it's a long list here to my right. If you have any specific questions about any projects you're working on, use the fact that you have René and his colleagues on this call. So feel free to ask questions. I see another red ball jumping up. Vicky, can you check whether any further questions coming in?
No, there are no further questions. I'm constantly checking it, but
perfect. Because if that is the case, and we had said we were doubting whether we should make this a 90 or 120-minute call. We still have about 10 minutes left, I guess. If there are no further questions, and I leave it open for a minute, then I'm happy to close this call. This has done exactly what we had hoped for, to get some answers and some ideas about some of the perceptions of open science, how to deal with it in practice, some very useful suggestions how to deal with practical situations, whether we deal with splitting off certain portions of the openness, so to say, or work with anonymized data, or just go for refunding of databases every 3 to 5 years, let's say 5 years. So last question to Vicky. I guess there are no more chats coming in.
no, indeed, there are no. So I think you can close the webinar.
I can see you smiling. I like that. Let me just use this last minute then to thank especially the colleagues from UNICA for organizing this and for their patience in guiding my low tech level through all of this. So thanks to Luciano and Vicky and Laura, and also my warm thanks to René and Françoise for their very useful presentations. I look forward to it next time, and I trust that UNICA will do this several more times, or I hope that they will. And let me with this just turn back to Luciano for some closing words. Luciano, the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, Piet. Very, very brief. Just to thank you for this initiative. I think it's been a very interesting webinar today. Thank you very much to the excellent speakers, to all the participants, and again to Laura and Vicky, who really worked so hard for this event. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish goodbye to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and please fill out the evaluation survey. So that's important to us. Thank you. Goodbye.
We will. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.